the cruel dare. The chandeliers above the Grand Etoria ballroom glittered like constellations trapped in glass, their light scattering across golden walls, mirrored panels, and a sea of silk gowns and polished tuxedos. It was the annual Children's Foundation Gala, an event that prided itself on generosity while dripping with excess. A single ticket cost more than most New Yorkers paid for rent in a month, yet the guests, bankers, socialites, celebrities, and power-hungry heirs, wore their wealth so casually it seemed invisible to them. Like air, waiters slipped through the crowd like shadows, trays balanced with champagne and canapes, their faces neutral, and their steps practiced to perfection. To the guests, they were little more than moving furniture, present only when convenient and forgotten the moment they turned away. For Naomi Carter, one of those waitresses, the night was just another battlefield in a life that had long since demanded more of her than it gave. Naomi was 24, though she carried herself with the gravity of someone twice her age. Her uniform was spotless, pressed with care, and her hair was neatly tied back into a bun. Still, no amount of polish could disguise the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been on her feet since morning, juggling shifts at 2 different jobs to help pay for her mother's medical bills. Years earlier, she had been a dancer with dreams that once stretched toward the Broadway stage. She still remembered the thrill of rehearsals, the sting of rosin on her fingers, the way the air itself seemed to pause when the music began. But life had a way of crushing delicate things, and when her family's world collapsed, she had folded up her dance shoes, tucked them into the back of her closet, and exchanged them for non-slip waitress shoes that carried no dreams at all. And yet somewhere deep inside her the fire had not died. As she moved between tables, balancing trays and murmuring polite greetings, Naomi sometimes imagined she was still dancing. Each turn, each graceful step, each perfectly measured movement carried the ghost of her training. To the guests, it was simply efficient service. To her, it was the last fragment of an identity she refused to fully surrender. Tonight, though, she was in no mood for fantasies. The ache in her feet was sharp, her hands trembled faintly from exhaustion, and her spirit still burned from the rejection letter that had arrived in the morning mail. She had reapplied for a scholarship at the Donovan Academy, hoping against hope that the school might offer her one last chance. Instead, she had received the same merciless words. "We regret to inform you." It was as she refilled water glasses, at table 16, that she first noticed him, the man whose arrogance would set the night ablaze. Ethan Kingsley, heir to Kingsley Holdings, a real estate empire that stretched across half the city skyline. His reputation preceded him, charming to investors, ruthless to rivals, and utterly dismissive of anyone he deemed beneath him. With slicked-back blonde hair, a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and a tuxedo that whispered custom tailoring from Milan, Ethan looked like the embodiment of privilege. At his side sat Veronica Hale, a statuesque brunette in a sapphire gown whose beauty was cold, calculated, and flawless. Around them lounged 2 of Ethan's closest friends, men cut from the same cloth of inherited wealth and empty arrogance. Naomi approached their table with the same calm professionalism she had offered 100 others that night. She placed down fresh glasses of champagne with steady hands, her face unreadable. But as she turned to step away, she felt it, the weight of his gaze. Ethan was watching her, his lips curved in a smirk that sent a chill down her spine. He leaned slightly toward his companions, his voice pitched just loudly enough to carry. "Look at them," he drawled, his eyes never leaving Naomi. "Like little wind-up toys. They move when told, smile when told, and vanish when they're done. Not a shred of life in them." His friends chuckled. Veronica gave a delicate laugh, like the tinkling of ice cubes, and the words struck Naomi's ears with the force of a slap. For a moment she froze, tray still in hand, her heart thudding painfully. Her manager's warning rang in her head. "Keep your head high, Carter. Be polite. Never react." She swallowed her anger, lifted her chin, and forced her feet to carry her away. But the humiliation lingered, clinging like smoke. She told herself she would endure. She always endured. Yet fate had other plans. because just as she reached the next table, Ethan's voice sliced across the ballroom again, this time sharper, more deliberate. "Wait, you there!" Naomi stopped in her tracks, every muscle in her body taut. Slowly, she turned back. All eyes at his table were fixed on her, and now, dozens more from the surrounding guests were glancing over with curiosity. Ethan leaned, back in his chair, swirling the champagne in his glass as though he owned not just the drink, but the entire evening. His smirk widened. "Tell me, waitress," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Can you do more than carry trays? Or is that the full extent of your talent?" Naomi's throat tightened, but she kept her voice level. "My job, sir, is to serve. If there is something you need, I'll attend to it." Ethan tilted his head, savoring her composure, then turned to his audience with a sly grin. "A woman who hides behind duty," he mused. "How dull. I wonder, does she have any spark at all?" Then with deliberate cruelty he set down his glass and stood. The movement drew silence across the tables nearest them, the guests pausing mid-conversation. Raising his voice, Ethan addressed Naomi directly, his words echoing across the ballroom. "Dance for us." The command dropped like a stone into water. Conversations stilled, forks hovered in the air, and a ripple of laughter spread among his friends. Naomi blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me?" she asked softly. Ethan's smirk sharpened. "Dance right here in front of everyone. Show us if there's anything more to you than carrying drinks, unless of course you're afraid." A flush rose to Naomi's cheeks, a storm of humiliation and fury swirling inside her chest. Wanted to break her, to turn her into a spectacle for his amusement. She could feel dozens of eyes now fixed on her, guests leaning forward, eager for drama. She thought of her manager's warning, of the job she desperately needed, of the bills stacked on her kitchen counter. She could walk away, swallow this humiliation, and let the night pass like all the others. But then she thought of something else, the rejection letter, the years of sacrifice, the girl she used to be with fire in her veins and music in her soul. Slowly, she lifted her chin, meeting Ethan's gaze without flinching. "I'm not afraid," Naomi said, her voice steady though her heart pounded. She set the tray down on the nearest table, slipped out of her shoes, and stepped toward the open space at the center of the ballroom. Gasps fluttered across the room. Ethan's smirk faltered for the briefest instant, replaced by the faintest flicker of surprise. The orchestra, sensing the sudden hush, trailed off uncertainly, and then all was silent. Every eye in the glittering room was now fixed on Naomi Carter, the waitress who had just accepted a dare meant to humiliate her. The music would return in a moment, and when it did, so too would something Naomi thought she had buried forever. The spotlight awakens. For a long moment, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The chandeliers glittered silently overhead, and the music had stopped altogether, as though the orchestra, too, was waiting to see what would happen next. Naomi stood in the center of the marble floor, shoeless, her black and white uniform a stark contrast to the gowns and tuxedos surrounding her. Every gaze in the room pressed down on her, heavy and expectant. And somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Ethan Kingsley leaned casually against his chair, his smirk daring her to crumble. He wanted her to falter, to stumble, to confirm in front of this entire assembly that she was nothing more than what he believed her to be, a servant pretending at dignity. Naomi felt the heat of shame burning her skin, but beneath it, a deeper fire stirred, something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Her chest rose and fell, and for the briefest instant she closed her eyes. She did not hear the guests murmuring or the mocking laughter of Ethan's friends. Instead, she heard something else, something from far away, hidden in memory. The swell of strings, the pounding rhythm of a piano, the hushed breath of an audience, waiting in the dark. It was a sound she had carried in her bones since childhood, the rhythm of dance, the heartbeat of her truest self. And in that moment, Naomi realized that this was not humiliation. This was a stage. She opened her eyes, lifted her chin, and with a voice steadier than she felt, she said clearly, "Play something." The orchestra, caught off guard, exchanged startled glances. For a second, no one moved. Then the conductor, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment, raised his baton. A single violin began, joined by a piano, tentative at first and then swelling into something stronger, richer. The first notes spread through the ballroom, and Naomi moved. The performance built to its crescendo. Naomi's heart raced as the orchestra thundered, the violins soaring, the drums pounding like the rhythm of her very blood. She launched into her final sequence, every ounce of her strength channeled into a storm of movement. Her body spun faster and faster, her arms cutting arcs of light, her feet striking the stage with power. And then, suddenly, stillness. She froze in her final pose, one arm lifted, her chest heaving, her eyes raised to the heavens as though reaching beyond the stage itself. The silence lasted for a single fragile heartbeat. Then the theater erupted. Applause crashed like a wave, surging through the seats, spilling out into the aisles. People rose to their feet in a standing ovation, their voices shouting, clapping, cheering. The sound was deafening, rolling through the grand hall until even the chandeliers seemed to tremble. Naomi's body shook with exhaustion, sweat glistening on her skin, tears filling her eyes, but she held her final pose, refusing to bow just yet. She wanted to feel the roar, to drink it in, to remind herself that it was real. From his box, Ethan sat rigid, his fists clenched on the railing. His humiliation was complete, his power drowned beneath the sound of voices that had chosen Naomi instead of him. He had tried to erase her, but in doing so, he had only amplified her. At last, Naomi lowered her arm, bowed, and the ovation only grew louder. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and somewhere backstage, Marcus Ellington closed his eyes with satisfaction. She had done it. Against all odds, Naomi Carter had claimed the stage, not as a waitress, not as a victim, but as an artist whose fire could not be extinguished. And yet, as she stepped back into the wings, her chest still heaving, Naomi knew this was not the end. Ethan's glare from the box was a promise. He was not finished, but neither was she. Tonight she had proved herself not just to the world, but to herself. And that was a power no smear campaign, no arrogant millionaire could ever take away. The transformation, the applause of the International Charity Showcase followed Naomi out of the theater like an echo that refused to fade. Even after the velvet curtains closed and the stage lights dimmed, she could still feel the thunder of it in her chest. She had gone onto that stage with doubt clawing at her spine, carrying the weight of every rejection, every sneer, every whispered word that told her she did not belong. Yet she had left it not as a waitress pretending at art, but as an artist reclaiming her truth. The ovation was proof, yes, but the real victory lay deeper. For the first time in years, she had believed in herself without apology. The days that followed were a whirlwind unlike anything Naomi had ever known. Interviews flooded in, reporters calling her the unexpected star of the showcase, social media ablaze with clips of her performance, strangers sending messages of gratitude and awe. Some called her a symbol of resilience. Others praised her as a reminder that talent could come from anywhere, that greatness did not always arrive with pedigree or privilege. Naomi read the words with humility, sometimes with tears, sometimes with disbelief, and always with a quiet awareness that she was standing on a knife's edge. Fame was fickle, applause even more so, but the fire inside her was real, and she knew now that it was hers to protect. Ethan Kingsley, meanwhile, was unraveling. The man who had once held a ballroom in the palm of his hand now found his name tied not to power but to disgrace. It began with whispers, then stories. How he had mocked Naomi at the gala, how he had tried to humiliate her, how his smear campaigns had backfired spectacularly. Investors who once courted him began to distance themselves. Allies who had laughed alongside him at the gala now avoided his gaze. His wealth was intact, but his reputation, his carefully polished image, had been tarnished in a way he could not buy his way out of. For a man like Ethan, that was a deeper wound than any loss of fortune. He had tried to erase Naomi with cruelty, but instead she had erased his power with grace. Naomi did not gloat. She did not need to. She had learned long ago that revenge was a shallow flame, one that burned hot and quickly faded. What mattered was not Ethan's downfall, but her own rise. And rise she did. Marcus Ellington, true to his word, offered her a place in his company, not as a charity case, but as a dancer he believed in. She trained harder than ever, rebuilding her body and refining her technique, determined to honor the chance she had been given. Night after night she pushed herself, not because she feared failure, but because she hungered for truth. Each rehearsal, each bruise, each aching muscle was not punishment, it was freedom reclaimed. Her first official performance with Marcus's company was held 6 months later at the very theater where she had stunned the world. The seats were filled with critics, patrons, and dreamers alike, the same chandeliers casting their golden light across the stage. But this time, Naomi did not step onto the floor as a surprise or an underdog. She stepped on as a dancer, her name printed in the program, her presence expected and celebrated. As the orchestra began, she felt the familiar rush, the spark that had first carried her across the ballroom floor months ago, and she danced not to prove, but to share. When the final note faded and the audience rose to their feet once more, Naomi bowed with a heart full of gratitude, not just for the applause, but for the journey that had led her here. Yet Naomi's story did not end with her own triumph. She remembered the nights of exhaustion, the years of invisibility, the weight of bills that had stolen her dream, and she thought of the countless others still caught in that struggle. She remembered her father's sacrifices, her mother's tears, her brother's hungry hope. And she knew she could not let her success be hers alone. With Marcus's help, Naomi established a foundation dedicated to supporting underprivileged dancers, young people with talent but no resources, dreamers with fire but no stage. The Naomi Carter Foundation offered scholarships, training, and opportunities to those who had been told, as she once had, that they did not belong. Her first public speech as founder was given at a small press conference, but her words carried across the city like an anthem. Standing at the podium, dressed simply, her voice steady and clear, she said, "For years I believed I had to be silent, invisible, just to survive. But art is not born from silence. It is born from struggle, from truth, from the courage to stand even when the world tells you to kneel. I want every child, every dreamer to know that your worth is not decided by the room you're standing in, or the people who look down on you. Your worth is decided by the fire you carry inside. Protect it, nurture it, and never, ever let anyone take it from you." The applause that followed was not as thunderous as the ovations she had received on stage, but it was deeper, more enduring, because it was the sound of people hearing not just a dancer, but a leader. Naomi left the podium with tears in her eyes, feeling her father's pride as though he were standing beside her, hearing his voice whisper once more, "I always knew you were born to shine." And so she did. Naomi Carter's name became etched not just into playbills and marquees, but into the hearts of those who saw themselves in her journey. She was no longer the waitress who had been dared to dance. She was the woman who had turned humiliation into triumph, cruelty into compassion, invisibility into radiance. She had not only reclaimed her dream, she had built a bridge for others to follow. Ethan Kingsley faded into obscurity, his arrogance remembered only as the spark that had ignited a fire far greater than himself. But Naomi Carter's fire endured, a beacon for all who dared to dream against the odds. Because in the end, her story was never just about a dance. It was about courage, the kind that survives the weight of silence, the kind that rises when pushed, down the kind that transforms not just one life but many. It was not a timid shuffle or the stiff imitation of dance her audience expected. It was fluid, sharp, and alive. She began with a slow turn, her bare feet whispering across the marble as though the floor had been waiting for her all along. Her arms rose in a graceful arc, precise yet unforced, and with each breath, the years she had buried seemed to fall away. The laughter that had bubbled up in the crowd stilled almost instantly, replaced by murmurs of surprise. Naomi was no longer a waitress in a pressed uniform. She was a dancer, and the ballroom had become her stage. Her body told a story the way words never could. In the sweep of her arms, in the strength of her leaps, in the controlled bend of her spine, the pain of lost years and the triumph of survival spilled forth. She moved with a precision that spoke of training and discipline, but also with a passion so raw it silenced the room. Even the most jaded of guests, people who had seen countless performances on Broadway and beyond, found themselves leaning forward, transfixed. Naomi's every step was both rebellion and release, every spin an unspoken declaration. I am more than what you see. Ethan's smirk faltered as the seconds stretched into minutes. He had expected stumbles, awkwardness, humiliation. Instead, he found himself and everyone else watching something extraordinary. Naomi's hair slipped free from its bun, strands catching the golden light as she turned. Her chest rose with exertion, her brow damp, yet she did not waver. Each note of music drew from her a response so instinctive it was as if her soul itself was dancing. By the time the violins soared, Naomi was no longer bound by fear or memory. She was alive, radiant, every movement sharp as fire and soft as water. The guests began to clap in rhythm, tentative at first, then louder, until applause thundered across the ballroom. Some stood, unable to resist the force of what they were witnessing. Veronica's elegant face tightened, her painted lips pressed into a thin line, while Ethan's companions shifted uneasily in their seats, their laughter long gone. Ethan himself sat rigid, his eyes fixed on Naomi, fury and disbelief warring behind his expression. Naomi spun once more, her body arching into a final pose, one arm lifted toward the glittering chandeliers as though reaching for the very stars. For a heartbeat, silence reigned again, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Then, as though the room had been holding itself back until it could no longer bear it, applause erupted in full. The sound was deafening, echoing through the golden hall like thunder. Guests rose from their seats, clapping, cheering, some even whistling in admiration. The applause was not polite, not the half-hearted clatter reserved for obligation. It was real, raw, and unstoppable. Naomi stood frozen, her chest heaving, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She had not felt this kind of exhilaration in years, not since before her father's accident, before life had pressed her into the grind of survival. It was as if the universe itself had reminded her in this moment who she truly was. She bowed her head slightly, more from instinct than intent, and the applause only grew louder. Somewhere near the orchestra pit, the conductor clapped as hard as any guest, his face alight with wonder. Ethan rose slowly from his chair, his jaw tight. He forced a thin smile, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He had been defeated in the very arena he had tried to control. His attempt to humiliate had instead created a legend. He lifted his glass as though to toast, but Naomi did not look at him. She was beyond him now. As the ovation finally began to soften, a ripple of movement spread near the far corner of the ballroom. A man in a dark suit, distinguished with silver at his temples, was pushing through the crowd, his eyes fixed on Naomi with intensity. He was Marcus Ellington, one of the most respected directors in the world of performing arts, and though Naomi did not know it yet, her life was about to change again. For now, she only stood at the center of the ballroom, heart racing, chest lifting with every hard-earned breath. The waitress had vanished, the dancer had returned, and the city that had once turned its back on her had just seen her rise again. The aftermath. The thunder of applause still echoed in Naomi's ears long after the last note faded, and the orchestra lowered their instruments. For a moment she simply stood there, chest rising and falling, overwhelmed by the roar of voices that had once ignored her. The same people who had looked through her minutes earlier now leaned toward her with admiration in their eyes, whispering her name as though she had suddenly become a mystery worth unraveling. Naomi's hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline. She had not felt alive like this in years. Every inch of her body burned, her muscles aching, her lungs raw, yet she felt stronger than she had ever been. The ballroom was a storm of reactions. Wealthy women in glittering gowns fanned themselves, some still clapping, others whispering to one another in disbelief. Men loosened their ties, leaning toward their companions, recounting the dance they had just witnessed as though retelling it could help them understand how a simple waitress had transformed into an artist before their eyes. The orchestra members exchanged knowing glances, their faces lit with the rare joy of having accompanied something authentic. Naomi could hear fragments of words float through the crowd. Extraordinary. Breathtaking. Where has she been hiding? And for the first time in years, her name was no longer a burden. It was a promise. At his table, Ethan Kingsley forced a hollow smile, but the cracks in his composure were visible to anyone who looked closely. His smirk had been replaced by clenched teeth, his glass raised not in triumph, but as a shield against humiliation. Veronica, draped in sapphire silk, sat stiffly, her arms folded as though she had been personally insulted. Ethan's two friends, who had laughed so loudly at Naomi's expense earlier, now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding his gaze. The power had shifted in the room, and everyone knew it. Naomi, the woman they had dismissed, had seized the spotlight, and Ethan, arrogant, untouchable Ethan, was left in the shadows of his own cruelty. Naomi did not gloat. She simply bowed her head not too low, just enough to acknowledge the audience without bending to them. With deliberate calm, she slipped back into her shoes, retrieved the silver tray she had left on a nearby table, and walked quietly toward the edge of the ballroom. The guests parted to let her pass, some touching her arm as she moved, others murmuring words of praise. She did not stop. She could not. Her heart was still too raw, her emotions too tangled between triumph and disbelief. She needed space, air, a moment to understand what she had just unleashed. But Naomi's retreat was not unnoticed. From the far side of the ballroom, the man with silver at his temples, Marcus Ellington, watched her intently. He was no ordinary guest. For decades, Marcus had been a titan of the performing arts, a director whose productions had filled theaters from New York to Paris, whose name was spoken with reverence by dancers and actors alike. He had come to the gala as a patron, but what he had witnessed was far more valuable than a donation. He had seen a fire, raw and unpolished but undeniably brilliant, and as Naomi disappeared into the service corridor, Marcus knew he could not let her vanish as easily as she had appeared. Back in the kitchen, Naomi leaned against the counter, her chest heaving as the adrenaline began to fade. The other staff, members who had been too busy working to witness the full performance, glanced at her with confusion, murmuring among themselves. Her manager, Genevieve Peterson, hurried over, eyes wide, clutching a clipboard to her chest. "Naomi, what did you just do?" she asked, her voice half shocked, half afraid. Naomi shook her head, unable to form an answer. She could still hear the echo of clapping in her ears, feel the sting of marble against her feet, taste the salt of tears she hadn't realized had spilled down her cheeks. "It doesn't matter," Naomi whispered finally. "It's over now. I still have work to finish." She straightened, smoothed her uniform, and picked up another tray, forcing her trembling hands to steady. She had learned long ago that moments of beauty were fragile things. They could vanish in an instant, swallowed by the weight of responsibility. Whatever had happened out there on the ballroom floor, she told herself it was nothing more than a spark that would fade once the night ended. She was wrong, because as the gala wound down, the spark began to spread. Guests with their phones discreetly tucked in jeweled clutches had recorded her performance, their shaky videos already racing across social media. By the time Naomi was polishing the last set of glasses in the kitchen, hashtags were trending, captions proclaiming, "The waitress who danced at the Grandatoria," lighting up feeds across the city. Within hours, millions of eyes would watch what Ethan Kingsley had intended as humiliation, but had instead become a triumph. When Naomi finally left the hotel after midnight, the city streets were quiet, slick with the shine of recent rain. She walked home with her uniform jacket pulled tight against the chill, her mind replaying the dance over and over. For the first time in years, she did not feel invisible. But the glow was tempered by doubt. She had seen how Ethan's eyes burned, with anger as the crowd applauded her. She knew men like him, they did not accept defeat gracefully. At her small apartment in Queens, Naomi hung her uniform neatly by the door and sank onto the worn couch, her exhaustion pressing heavily into her bones. She turned on her phone, not expecting much, only to find her notifications overflowing. Messages from co-workers, from old friends she hadn't spoken to in years, even from strangers who had seen the video. Her inbox was full of words like incredible, you're an inspiration, and don't stop. Naomi stared at the screen in stunned silence, her breath catching as tears welled in her eyes. It was too much, too sudden, too impossible to believe. Then her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was calm, deep, and certain. Miss Carter, my name is Marcus Ellington. I was at the Grandatoria tonight. What I saw was extraordinary. I believe you have a gift the world should not be denied. If you're willing, I'd like you to come to my studio tomorrow morning. I want to see you dance again. Naomi's hand shook as she held the phone, her breath shallow, her mind racing. She had no words, only silence, until finally, in a voice so small it barely carried, she whispered, yes. She ended the call and sat frozen in the dim light of her apartment, the city's hum outside her window like the faint rhythm of distant music. For years she had buried her dream, convinced it had been stolen forever. But tonight, in the unlikeliest of places, that dream had clawed its way back into the light. Tomorrow it would face its first true test, and somewhere else in the city, Ethan Kingsley poured himself another glass of whiskey, his jaw clenched, his pride bleeding. He would not forget what had happened tonight, and he would not forgive. The audition. The morning after the gala dawned gray and damp, the city veiled in a mist that clung to the skyline like a secret. Naomi woke from restless sleep, her body sore but her mind restless with anticipation. She had replayed the events of the night 100 times in her head, her humiliation turned triumph, the applause, the call from Marcus Ellington. And now, she found herself on the edge of something she couldn't yet name. Her small apartment, with its peeling wallpaper and humming radiator, suddenly felt too small, too fragile to contain the possibilities stirring within her. She sat at the edge of her bed, lacing up an old pair of sneakers, the only footwear she owned that could withstand a studio floor, and whispered to herself, this isn't a dream, you're going. The subway ride downtown was crowded and slow, the air thick with the scent of wet umbrellas and stale coffee, but Naomi barely noticed. Her thoughts ran faster than the train, filled with flashes of music, movement, and faces from last night. She saw Ethan's mocking smirk turning into shock, the guests rising to their feet, and Marcus Ellington's silver-templed gaze fixed on her like a promise. She didn't know why he had chosen her, a waitress with no resume, no academy name left to boast of, but something in his voice had carried weight. He had not asked. He had declared, you have a gift. And so she came. The studio was tucked inside a quiet building on West 52nd, an unassuming brick facade that gave no hint of what lay inside. Naomi pushed through the heavy glass doors and found herself in a lobby filled with posters of past productions, grand, sweeping images of dancers mid-flight, their bodies sculpted in light and shadow. She paused, overwhelmed, recognizing titles she had once dreamed of performing in. Swan Lake, Giselle, Firebird. For a moment, she felt like an intruder, a shadow standing where stars had once stood. Then a young receptionist appeared, smiling warmly, and said, Miss Carter, Mr. Ellington is expecting you. Studio 3 down the hall. Naomi followed the directions, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Studio 3 was spacious and bright, with mirrors running along, one wall and sunlight spilling through tall windows. Marcus Ellington stood near the piano, his posture impeccable despite his age, his eyes sharp as they swept over her. He was not alone. A small group of observers, 3 women and 2 men, all dressed elegantly, stood with clipboards in hand. Naomi's breath caught as realization sank in. This wasn't just an invitation, it was an audition. Miss Carter, Marcus said, his voice carrying both authority and warmth. I'm grateful you came. What I saw last night was raw, unpolished perhaps, but rare. Today I want to see if it was a spark or a fire. Are you ready? Naomi swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir. The pianist sat at the bench, waiting. Marcus gestured for her to take the center of the floor. Naomi stepped forward, her reflection in the mirror staring back at her. Tired eyes, worn clothes, nothing of the glamour that belonged to the dancers in the posters outside. For a brief moment, self-doubt clawed at her chest. What if last night was a fluke? What if I'm not enough? But then she remembered the applause, the roar of voices rising in unison, the feeling of freedom in every spin. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and when the piano began, she moved. This time there was no marble floor, no chandeliers, no audience dressed in diamonds. It was just her and the music, bare, vulnerable. She let go of everything she carried, the years of struggle, the sting of rejection, the endless weight of survival, and allowed her body to speak. Her arms cut through the air, her feet traced invisible patterns across the floor, her chest lifted with each swell of the piano. The mirrors reflected not a waitress, but a woman reclaiming the language of her soul. The observers scribbled furiously, whispering among themselves. Marcus watched in silence, his face unreadable, but his eyes followed her every move with unwavering focus. Naomi danced until her lungs burned, until her legs trembled, and when at last she collapsed into her final pose, she remained there for a long breath, the silence ringing louder than applause. When she finally lifted her head, she saw Marcus nod once, slowly. That, he said quietly, was not a spark. That was fire. But before Naomi could even register relief, a voice from the back of the studio cut through the air, sharp and poisonous. Fire, perhaps, but uncontrolled, dangerous, and frankly, unprofessional. Naomi turned, startled, to see a figure she had not expected. Ethan Kingsley leaning casually in the doorway, his tailored suit immaculate, his smirk restored. He strolled into the room with the easy arrogance of someone who knew he belonged wherever he chose to stand. "What is this, Marcus?" Ethan asked smoothly, addressing the director as though Naomi were invisible. "Some waitress plucked off." "The street? You can't be serious." Marcus's jaw tightened. "This is my studio, Ethan. She's here because I invited her." Ethan chuckled, sipping from a coffee he had brought in, his eyes flicking toward Naomi with open disdain. Invited her, or fell for a viral stunt? Half the city is talking about her little performance last night, but let's not pretend it was anything more than a trick of the moment. She doesn't belong here, not with real dancers. Naomi's heart pounded, humiliation threatening to rise again, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I belong wherever I choose to stand," she said quietly. The steadiness of her voice, surprising even her. Ethan's smirk faltered for just a second before he waved dismissively. "She's not ready," one of the observers muttered, swayed by Ethan's presence. Another nodded reluctantly, scribbling something on her clipboard. Naomi's stomach clenched as she realized what was happening. Ethan wasn't just here to mock her. He was here to sabotage her. Marcus raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. His eyes burned into Ethan, then softened as he looked at Naomi. "Talent doesn't need permission," he said firmly. "And what I see in her is undeniable. The world may not be ready for her yet, but she is ready for the world. She will return tomorrow for a second round, and if anyone doubts her, let them stay home." The authority in his voice left no room for argument. Ethan's jaw tightened, his smile fading as the observers fell silent. Naomi stood frozen, her chest heaving, her mind reeling from the clash she had just endured. She wanted to crumble, to hide, but instead she stood taller, meeting Marcus's gaze with gratitude and Ethan's with defiance. The audition was not over. It had only begun. The battle within. The city had always been relentless, but in the days following Naomi's audition, it seemed even harsher. The November wind cut through the avenues like shards of glass, the sidewalks crowded with strangers hurrying past each other, every face wrapped in its own private world. Naomi felt caught between two existences, the waitress who still clocked in for double shifts to keep the bills from swallowing her home, and the dancer who had stepped onto the marble floor of the Grand Atoria and reminded herself and everyone else that she was more than invisible. That duality weighed on her with every breath. In the mornings, she poured coffee for businessmen who never met her eyes. In the evenings, she returned to Marcus Ellington's studio, where she was pushed to her limits, reminded at every moment of what she had once been and what she might still become. But as exhilarating as those hours at the studio were, they were also brutal. Her body, long deprived of training, ached in ways she hadn't felt since her teenage years at the academy. Muscles screamed, her joints stiffened, and blisters blossomed across her feet. At night, she would collapse onto her couch, too tired even to eat. Sometimes she stared at the rejection letters still tucked into the drawer by her bed, reminders of every door that had been closed to her. Why now? She often wondered. Why this second chance, and why me? For each step forward, a shadow of doubt followed closely behind, whispering that she was an imposter, that the applause had been a fluke, that she would be exposed and discarded once again. And then came the headlines. It began as a trickle on social media, grainy videos from the gala paired with breathless captions about the waitress who shocked the elite. But it didn't take long before larger outlets picked it up. Some articles praised her as a symbol of perseverance and raw talent, a woman who had forced the wealthy to see her humanity. Yet others, fueled by carefully planted whispers, began to turn the story sour. Naomi read one headline on her phone during a break at the diner and felt her stomach twist. Overnight sensation or staged spectacle? The truth behind the waitress. Who danced? Another claimed she had deliberately sought attention, mocking her as a viral opportunist who craved pity. The worst came from a glossy magazine with Ethan Kingsley's name buried subtly among the investors. Talent or trickery? Why Naomi Carter doesn't belong on the stage. It was clear to her who stood behind it. Ethan was not finished. She could see his hand in the sudden smear, his influence seeping into the very channels that shaped opinion. He had power, wealth, and reach, and he would not allow his humiliation at the gala to stand without retaliation. Naomi felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Every time she walked into the studio, she saw the skeptical looks from some of the observers, people swayed by the narrative Ethan was weaving. Every time she served tables, she felt the sidelong glances from customers who recognized her face from the news, but weren't sure whether to admire or mock her. Marcus, ever steady, dismissed the noise. The world will always try to tell you who you are, he told her one evening after rehearsal, his voice calm but firm. Your task is to show them, not tell them. Do not mistake their doubt for truth. He believed in her, and his words planted seeds of strength. But Naomi still carried the heaviness of living two lives. When she returned home, her younger brother Daniel, only 17 and still finishing school, would ask how rehearsals were going, his wide eyes full of hope. Naomi always forced a smile, telling him they were fine, that everything would work out, though inside she battled storms of uncertainty. One night, after a particularly grueling rehearsal where her legs had buckled beneath her during a spin and she had fallen hard against the wooden floor, Naomi sat alone in the empty studio. The mirrors reflected her exhaustion back at her, a girl in sweat-drenched clothes, hair plastered to her forehead, face pale with fatigue. Tears stung her eyes, not just from the pain but from the crushing sense that perhaps Ethan was right, that she did not belong, that she was trying to resurrect a dream too broken to save. For a long time she sat there, silent, staring at the reflection of someone who looked more like a survivor than a dancer. But then she remembered the sound of applause, the thunder of it echoing through the ballroom. She remembered the way the crowd had risen to their feet, not because they had been instructed to, but because they could not help themselves. She remembered how alive she had felt in that moment, how her body had spoken truths her voice never could. And she thought of her father, once so strong, now confined to a chair, who used to whisper to her, "Don't you ever let them decide what you are worth." The memory struck like a flame against dry wood. igniting something fierce in her chest. Naomi rose unsteadily to her feet, her muscles screaming, and walked to the center of the studio. She stared at her reflection, at the tired girl with doubt in her eyes, and she shook her head. "No more," she whispered. "I won't bow again." She lifted her arms, turned slowly, and began to dance. Not for Marcus, not for the audience, not for Ethan or the critics. She danced for herself, for the girl who had once dreamed without fear, for the woman who had survived when everything had tried to break her. The movements were raw, imperfect, but they carried a truth so sharp it pierced her own heart. By the time she stopped, her chest was heaving, tears streaked her cheeks, but she felt lighter, freer. The battle outside, Ethan's smear campaigns, the critics, the whispers, still raged, but she understood now that the real war was within her. And in that war she had just chosen her side. Naomi Carter would not be erased. Not again. Not ever. The big stage. The night of the International Charity Showcase arrived like a storm sweeping across the city. It was one of the most anticipated cultural events of the year, a global broadcast that reached millions of homes where artists from every corner of the world performed not just for applause, but for causes that mattered. The Grand Metropolis Theater had never gleamed brighter. Its vast chandelier shone like a sun trapped in crystal, its velvet curtains heavy with decades of history. For Naomi, standing backstage in the dim light, the air thick with the scent of powder and rosin, it felt like the threshold between two lives. One step forward would take her into the unknown, into a spotlight so bright it could either blind her or reveal her. Her heart pounded beneath the fitted costume Marcus had chosen. For her, simple yet elegant, a flowing gown of deep emerald that shimmered when she moved. It was the first time in years she had worn anything close to a dancer's costume, and as the fabric brushed her skin, it felt like reclaiming a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. She closed her eyes, inhaling the muffled hum of the crowd beyond the curtain. Thousands were seated in the theater, but millions more were waiting across television screens and live streams. This was no longer just about one arrogant man's dare at a gala. This was about every rejection, every night of exhaustion, every voice that had told her she did not belong. Tonight she would answer them all. But shadows still lingered. In the days leading up to the showcase, the smear campaign had intensified. Ethan Kingsley, humiliated by his loss of control, had used every connection at his disposal to plant doubts about her. Rumors whispered through the press, accusations that she had fabricated her struggles for sympathy, that her dance at the gala had been rehearsed for attention, that she was nothing more than a waitress using pity as a ladder. Even here at the showcase, Naomi could sense the skepticism. Backstage, other performers eyed her curiously, some with admiration, others with the wary distance reserved for outsiders who had not paid their dues through traditional paths. Ethan had poisoned the air, and Naomi knew it. She also knew he was here. Earlier she had seen him from afar, seated in a gilded box near the stage, Veronica beside him, their faces sharp under the glow of chandelier light. He was a major donor to the event, his name etched onto programs and plaques, and with that came influence. Naomi could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her, a silent threat that he would find a way to make her stumble. Marcus had warned her to stay focused, that Ethan's power could only reach so far, but she knew men like Ethan thrived in moments like these, moments when one mistake could undo everything. The stage manager gave her the signal. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. The orchestra lifted their instruments, the curtain began to rise, and the vast expanse of the theater revealed itself. The lights blinded her at first, so bright she could not see the faces in the audience, only a golden haze of expectation. For one terrifying heartbeat, her body froze. The whispers of doubt surged up again, telling her she did not belong. That Ethan's laughter was waiting just beyond the glow. But then she heard something else. The faint memory of applause from the gala, the echo of her father's voice telling her never to let anyone decide her worth, the sound of her brother's hopeful laugh when she told him she had another chance. She straightened her spine, lifted her arms, and the music began. It was not a timid beginning. From the first note, Naomi poured herself into the performance with a ferocity that silenced every doubt. Her movements were not just technical, they were confessions, revelations carved into space. She spun, leapt, and stretched, her body a story of survival and rebirth. The emerald gown flowed around her like liquid flame, every sweep of fabric amplifying her intensity. She let the music carry her into the deepest corners of her soul, drawing out pain, joy, defiance, and hope, and offering it all to the audience. She was no longer dancing for them. She was dancing in spite of them. Ethan watched from his box, his smirk faltering as the crowd leaned forward, captivated. He had thought to see her stumble, to watch her drown under the weight of her own nerves. Instead, he saw her rise, commanding the stage with a presence even seasoned professionals struggled to hold. He clenched his jaw, whispering something sharp to Veronica, but she too could not tear her gaze away from Naomi's defiance. It was as though the very thing he had tried to destroy had only grown stronger under the pressure of his cruelty.